Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. And I would like to thank Delphi Forum for bringing us back to Delphi, eventually. I'm Nektaria Stamouli. I'm a reporter for Athens News Agency, and I'm also the regional correspondent for Politico Europe. With me today is a distinguished guest, Mr. Yanzhong Huang, who is a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations. So we're going to try to look into a very timely and very important issue about how the pandemic reveals the deficiencies in the current global governance structure and to what extent the Ukrainian crisis may complicate the global efforts to fix it. So, Mr. Huang, thank you very much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, Nektaria.
It's okay, we're gonna.
Yes,
the names are difficult for both of us.
With pronouncing each other's name.
Okay, so let's get started on that. So it's clear that the international community and the institutions were not ready to deal with the pandemic. How would you evaluate the global response? And if we did not have the war in Ukraine, would the international institutions be ready to eradicate the pandemic and finally we could move to a post-COVID era?
Well, it's been more than 2 years since we entered the pandemic, right? Based on the WHO announcement.
It's been too long.
Yeah, it's been too long. I'm sick of it. But if you look at the global response to the pandemic, right, it's simply speaking, that's a state-centric, uncoordinated response to a global pandemic that you would expect, right, would be the rally point, right, to mobilize the people, right, all over the world, right, the countries all over the world to fight a common enemy. That didn't happen, right, apparently, right, if you look at, right, this lack of coordination, on international travel and trade, just to travel to Greece, which is pretty easy, right? You just need to show this vaccination certificate. Actually, before entering Greece, actually, after I came to this country, I only need to show the passport, right? But if you're traveling to China, that probably is. I don't know, it's not necessarily as difficult as traveling to Mars, but think about the challenges of traveling there. Get the approval first, right? Then you need to, in the US, you need to spend 1 week, for the self-health management at the city, right, that you're going to depart for China. Receiving multiple tests before flying there. After you land, but you need to be subject for another 3 weeks of quarantine, right, at the designated hotels at your own expense, right? This, see that this difference, right? The lack of coordination on entry, and exit screening measures. Right? Then you have this trade, disruption on the supply chain. I've been driving my car for 10 years. I want to buy a new one in the US, right? But I was told now it's difficult to even buy a new car there, right? It's the reason is because of the disruption of the supply chain. There's also the problem, the tools, right? That we talk about, in the beginning, but before the availability of the vaccines, right, and therapeutic means, pretty much the tools in our toolbox no different from that in 600 years ago, right? That's the quarantine, right, which is still caused by the heavily used in countries like China, right, to be like a silver bullet, right, in fighting the pandemic. And once even after the vaccines become available, right, then this is problem of vaccine nationalism, right? The wealthy nations, basically, right, hoard the vaccines, right, for their own population, right? But even today, right, 100 nations still were actually well fall short of, the goal of vaccinating 70% of the population by September this year. And now even 17 wealthy nations are still falling short of their goal of vaccinating more than 70% of their population. And then you look at the pandemic origins probe, right? This is of critical importance for our, if we want to prepare for the next pandemic, right? But now, after 2 years, this still in the impasse, right? We may never find what happened, right? We may never find the cause of this pandemic, right? In part because that pandemic response has been so heavily politicized, and the global pandemic response is framed as a battle between two ideologies, between authoritarianism and liberal democracy, right? Whose political system is superior to the others, right? And then, of course, there's the Ukrainian crisis, basically suck the oxygen out of the room, right, on pandemic control, right? There's less money and attention will become available on global pandemic response, right? It also, right, that has exacerbated the trust issues between nations, but certainly, right, you have Russia and China on the one camp, the Western countries on the other. There's conspiracy theories, disinformation become a very serious concern, right? You have read how, right, the Russians are talking about, right, the U.S. developing biological weapons in Ukraine, right? And there's also, right, this indication, right, that China or the U.S. is behind the creation of the pandemic virus, right? So see how, right, this has become the Ukrainian crisis being so complicated, right? The global pandemic response.
So, do you think that the geopolitical polarization coming from the war in Ukraine will it make it more difficult for institutions globally to coordinate in case there is a new crisis? And if we move after this war to a new Cold War, would it make coordination even more difficult?
Well, technically, even though we move to a Cold War, it's not necessarily going to prevent nations from working together in dealing with a common enemy, right? We know, right, during the Cold War era, right, Russians, right, the Americans, Western countries, they work together, right, in developing, right, the polio vaccines, in eradicating smallpox, right? And also, right, in terms of developing, right, the primary health care agenda, right? Even during the Cold War era, the countries, but still, right, they were able to work together, right, to fight, deal with a common global challenge. But this time, I think this is probably the first time you saw how ideology, right, entered the global pandemic response, right? So when you frame, right, the global pandemic response as a competition, right, a strategic competition between China and the West world, between democracy and authoritarianism, right? That politicization makes it more difficult for countries to work together, right? So you saw how actually we are working. Yesterday we had a meeting. I had to attend it virtually on how we could identify areas, right, for the U.S. and China to work together, right, on global health security, right? We identified some of the important issue areas like travel restriction, right? Global biosafety and biosecurity, right? The supply chain, right? The countering disinformation, right? Vaccines and therapeutics. But when you look at the political atmosphere, it's very frustrating, right? So far, there's no serious discussion, right, between two countries, right? How to work together. They have no serious dialogue between the two. right? On the U.S. side, basically, they were saying, that they were afraid China was going to use that opportunity as like a PR campaign instead of seriously engage with the United States. And China basically say, well, if you don't want to, if you still want to, right, contain us, don't expect us to cooperate with you, right, on global health. So it's an unfortunate situation.
Yeah. Some say that the responsibilities for the global outbreak of the pandemic begin with the Chinese authorities. Do you think that the rapid economic development, the rapid economic growth that is expected from China in the next 10 years, the next decade, it would complicate, not only make things more difficult for the climate crisis, but also for the health crisis?
Well, when we examine the emergence and re-emergence of the pathogens, infectious disease outbreaks, right, one of the important contributors, right, is the rapid economic development, right, urbanization, industrialization, right, the movement of the people, right, immigrant population, like in China, but they have 126 migrant workers, right? So these factors, but these developments, essentially maximize the exposure, right, the people's exposure to the viruses. It also allows infection, right, that is present in remote villages, right, to reach larger cities and spread there, and it also spread to other regions once they are there, right? So there's also this issue of mega cities, right? That this close proximity, that expose, right? This major increase in infectious diseases that are airborne, that are waterborne, or the transmission, by contact, right? So, in a way, right, that this pandemic, what we're seeing, right, it's like a perfect storm, right? It's that has been in the making for a while. But to be fair, right, if you look at China's response, right, that even though, right, it could have, done a better job, right, in terms of, transparency, in terms of decisive action, but and that outcome would be different, right, had they been transparent, had they been decisive, right, from the get-go. But we know, right, that any country, that was hit by a novel virus like COVID-19 would stumble, right? Not to mention, right, that many countries, even though, right, they were alerted about the outbreak, but still this bureaucratic inertia, this efforts to downplay, the seriousness of the problem were found in liberal democracies, including the United States, UK, India, and other countries, right? So, you cannot simply blame a particular country for causing all the problems. Again, to be fair, if you look at Beijing's response compared with the SARS outbreak, it's actually improved significantly, right? It took China 3 months to act decisively on SARS, but this time it took them only 25 days. Right?
So after 2 years, you think that China and the West are more ready to work closely with each other in case there's a new crisis, despite any geopolitical differences they might have?
I'm not so confident, again, but it's, in the U.S. again with this Ukrainian crisis, I feel like the pandemic is quickly becoming a forgotten pandemic, right? People have very only short-term memory or attention span, So if you look at the WHO's, right, this governance capacity, right? Many of these issues, that we talk about, right? Like internal leadership and governance and management issues, the funding, gap, this is the mismatch between the capabilities and the mandates, and the global, governance issues, like, the relationship between the WHO and its member states. Right? Now that these problems have been seriously addressed, we're talking about revising the international health regulations. We're talking about have a new pandemic, kind of a pandemic treaty. But in my humble opinion, right, as long as we don't seriously reform the relationship between the WHO and the member states, don't expect, right, that we have fixed that problem of global governance, and so it's just a matter of time for us to expect another pandemic. Right?
What about how different institutions dealt with this pandemic? What do you think about COVAX? Was it a success? What about the US and the role it played in this crisis globally?
I think about the COVAX, it's, to those who don't know, right, the COVAX the facility, right, it's an effort, right, to reduce the global inequality in vaccine access. So basically, they want to coax, right, all the countries to pour money, right, to place advance orders, for vaccine doses, right? So the participating countries, right, that they would then share those doses equitably, right? Ideally, to populate to this most vulnerable population first, right? So this is the effort to increase the access of the vaccines of the developing countries. That idea is not new, right? It started, for example, the PIP framework, the pandemic influenza preparation framework negotiated by the WHO in 2011. But that was the first time, right, that this idea being transformed into practice. They have done a great job, right, in mitigating this access gap between the wealthy nations and low-income countries. But I think we sort of underestimated, right, this desperation and myopia in wealthy nations, right, in hoarding the vaccines or for their own population. So that vaccine nationalism is becoming a big concern there. Right, according to a recent study, right, the low-income and the lower middle-income countries, right, they experience the greatest, right, proportional gap between allocated and delivered vaccines. So the speed of the delivery for the COVAX is slow, right? So far, actually, by the end of 2021, they have delivered 900 million doses to 144 countries. That actually falls short of the 2 billion doses they promised. So that's and then there's this challenge of funding, right? The COVAX, they have raised only $11 billion, that falls short of the 18 billion that initially they said it needs, right? So the funding, the gap could cost another 1.25 million lives. So I think it has made great progress, but in the meantime, there's a lot of falls short of, right, delivering the vaccine in the efficient way.
You mentioned vaccine nationalism. One last question, because I think we're running out of time. You mentioned vaccine nationalism, and President Biden has proposed the waiving of patents. But this proposal was not followed up. Do you think that this would have helped?
Yeah, for the United States, but it was the undisputed global health leader, right, before the pandemic, the so-called two Washingtons, Washington, the U.S. government, and the Gates Foundation, right? They essentially, right, contribute the lion's share of the global health funding. But certainly in the beginning stage of the COVID outbreak under Trump, right, that essentially abdicated U.S. global health leadership, by practicing, vaccine nationalism, withdrawing from the WHO. The Biden administration will actually start to move away from this vaccine nationalism. They promised, right, that to supply the vaccines, right, I think, but to donate 1.1 billion doses by the 2023, but so far it has only delivered half of the doses. That is becoming actually a concern, actually undermine the U.S. vaccine diplomacy. So there's still, I think, a lot that needs to be done in order for the U.S. to effectively engage the global health.
Mr. Huang, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. Another very interesting panel is coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.